So we are going to start today with lesson 2, which is about why did the Europeans come to Canada? And in our previous lesson, we talked about how the ancestors of today's Indigenous people had come over from Asia about over 10,000 years ago across what is this land bridge here through the Bering Strait during the last ice age, and they had come in, and they had after that kind of spread all around the continent and kind of filled all of North America. They eventually went all the way down to South America, Central America, and they filled the entire Western Hemisphere. And they created their own independent civilization. And so what we're talking about today is how did the Europeans come over there and discover this civilization? Now, as we talked about last week, it wasn't just one civilization, there were many, right? The Musqueam, who live in BC, who live in Vancouver, are very different than the people who lived in South America, for example. And I want to highlight two civilizations in particular that were really important. So down here in South America, in this area that I'm circling, there were the Inca. Now the Inca were an empire that was extraordinarily rich, and they had an extraordinary empire with many cities and many people, huge amounts of gold, huge power and wealth. And another giant empire was down here in what's today Mexico, and this would have been the empire of the Aztecs. And those are two different kind of indigenous groups to the Americas. And you'll notice that both of them are further towards the south. And I think part of the reason for this is that it's warmer down there, so you can grow more food, and the more food you can grow, the more people you can afford to kind of have in one place. So those were two really major civilizations that existed here in the Americas. And of course, like we talked about in our first video, up here in Canada, there were many different First Peoples, all of whom had very different ways of life, but shared a common civilization. What's going on in the rest of the world at this time, you might ask? Well, let's take a look at this picture here of what a map would look like for a European in the Middle Ages. So as you can tell, this map of the world is missing quite a bit. It's got some things in it. So there's right over here, you can see Italy, right down here where, if you're down here in Italy, where it looks kind of like a boot, and you can see up here, Ireland and Britain. You can see Europe, and then down here you can see a bit of Africa, but as you can tell, the map makers don't know very much about it. And then you can see Asia, and as you can tell, the map makers really don't know very much about that either. Right, so here we're talking about a part of the world the Europeans do not know very well. And this is taken in 1490, so that's 1,490 years after the birth of Christ, and this is in a time in Europe we call the Middle Ages. And at this time, people didn't really know their way around the world very well. In fact, the only Europeans that were really doing much sailing or exploring were these folks, the Vikings. Now, the Vikings were people who lived up into the northern part of Europe. So that's, basically what's currently Scandinavia. So that's Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and that kind of region. And they lived up there, and they would take their boats, and they were very aggressive people. And so the way that they kind of made their living is their men would go from village to village in other parts of Europe, and they would go into those villages and they would pillage them. And by pillaging, what I mean is that they would just go in, they would run it over, they would take away food, they would take away money, they would take away goods, they would take away supplies, and they would take those back to their own homes, and they would use those as kind of a way to enrich themselves. And so people all across Europe were terrified of these Vikings. But one thing you get good at when you have to boat a lot to pillage people is boating, and is navigation, and is being out on the ocean. And so early on, about 1,000 years after the birth of Christ, so right in the beginning of the Middle Ages, what we've got going on is the Vikings accidentally end up in what is currently Canada. So if you look at this map, they accidentally made their way from what is today around Norway, and they settled in Iceland, and their descendants, their great grandchildren, are still the ones that are there now. Then they set up a colony in Greenland, and fun story, it was called Greenland because the gentleman who set it up wanted to persuade other people to come there. It was never a very green land. It was always very, very cold. It's up near the Arctic. And from there, some explorers went further on, and they ended up in what is now part of Nunavut, and then down towards where is now Newfoundland and Labrador. And they started a colony there. The colony just didn't really work out for them. They fought with the indigenous people, And eventually they fought, and they kept losing. So they kind of gave up and they went back home to Greenland. And so they are probably the first Europeans to have come over to North America uh, before Christopher Columbus came over, and the other kind of Europeans several hundred years later. But they didn't really establish a permanent settlement, which is one of the reasons we don't talk about them very much. I do want to talk to you guys about just a little bit about two other kind of possible groups that may have come over here. And these ones are ones that people guess about and think might have come over, but there's no proof, right? So I don't want you to go around saying, oh, this definitely happened. Here we've got St. Brendan, and in the Middle Ages, as people in what used to be the Roman Empire were converting to Christianity, one big group that converted were the Irish by St. Patrick. And one of the things that happened in Ireland afterwards is there was huge numbers of monks and nuns. And they would travel in these little boats in the ocean, in the Irish Sea, in the North Sea, up in the North Atlantic. And they would seek out places where they could go and preach the gospel. And St. Brendan was well known for doing that. And some people think that he may have, according to a book that was written around the time, gone all the way by accident to what is now North America. Now, again, there's not really very much proof for this, but it was written about in a book from about that time. And people will argue about, okay, well, did it actually happen? Or did maybe he land in a place like Iceland? Or did he land in another place and thought it was what we would currently call North America? Another idea that's really popular, and this isn't Europeans, but China during the Middle Ages was an extremely powerful and rich empire. More powerful, more rich than even any of the European countries would have been. And they were a major trading power, and they would send their ships, and their ships were called junks, Junks, all around South Asia. And what they would do is they would trade for spices and for other goods with many other regions and many other countries, like what is currently India and what is currently Malaysia and what is currently like Singapore and Indonesia and Japan. And some people think that maybe one of their trading boats ended up all the way on the other side of the Pacific Ocean in now what is near where we are. Now, again, there's no real proof for that other than things that people have written in their diaries. But we don't know what they really landed on. Maybe they landed on an island that wasn't North America, and we think today that it was North America. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about in history is the things we know and the things we don't know. And historians, the people who study history, go and they try to evaluate or figure out if these claims are true or false. So we do know the Vikings came over to what is now Canada around 1000. And they stayed for a little while, but eventually didn't really work out well for them. So they left. And then it was several hundred years where there was no European contact with North America. But one thing there was contact with was Asia. And the Europeans would travel east. And the reason that they would do that is because they wanted to trade for various goods that were produced in Asia, but you couldn't find very easily in Europe. And one of the big ones that they wanted were spices. Now, you've got to remember, during the Middle Ages, there was no electricity, so you didn't really have a refrigerator. So one of the ways you would preserve food is you would dry it, or you would smoke it, or do something like that. But often it didn't taste very good after you cooked it back up. And sometimes it would spoil and just really not be very good. So the way some people wanted to increase their the tastiness of the food they ate is they would get spices. They would get things like turmeric or curry or coriander and that sort of thing. And they would bring it back to Europe. And once they had done that, they could, spice their food. And people also wanted other things like Chinese textiles, like silk, that you couldn't produce in Europe. So they would trade all along this route called the Silk Road. And people would travel thousands and thousands of kilometers. And they would trade with trader after trader after trader, all the way until they got to China or to India or to various parts of the Middle East. And they would bring it back to Europe for people to eat, to enjoy, to use for whatever. But in about 1450, in the late Middle Ages, many European leaders were seeking new ways to get to Asia so they could trade with people in China, India, and Japan. So you're going to take your worksheet now, and the bolded words in this worksheet you're going to use to fill in the blanks on yours. So in the late Middle Ages, we get to Asia so they could trade with people in China, India, and Japan. So feel free to pause the video if you don't have your sheet to fill those in. Now the overland route, the route that you would take to go to Asia from Europe, was called the Great Silk Road. And it was blocked for a lot of reasons around politics and fighting in the Middle East. There was a lot of fighting around the Holy Land because the people who lived in Arabia and who had kind of expanded out from there all across the Middle East were Muslim. And of course, the people who lived in Europe were mostly Christian. And so there was a lot of fighting and politics. And so it was really expensive and difficult to get all the way to China or to Central Asia in order to get these spices and these other goods. So the Europeans wanted to see if they could find other ways to get to Asia. Now, if we look back at this map that the Europeans thought the world looked like at the time, you can see here's Europe that I'm kind of circling right now with my cursor, and here's Asia. And so what they started to think they could do is maybe they could take boats and go west across the Atlantic and then end up on the other side of the world over by Asia. Of course, they didn't know that there was something in between. So as we were discussing, there were so many reasons that the Europeans couldn't make it to Asia via the overland route. So one of the things they decided to do was send explorers out on boats to map out more of the world and see if they could find a route to Asia. And here you have one of the earlier explorers, a gentleman named Christopher Columbus. He was an Italian, but he was working for the Spanish government. There's the King Ferdinand of Spain and Queen Isabella of Spain. And he's presenting to them basically this idea of, well, why don't I take these boats and sail them west, right into the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, and we'll go all the way around to the other side of the world and end up in Asia. And a lot of people had known that the world was a sphere. It's possible to know that from astronomy, even if you haven't mapped out the entire world. So the idea that they were worried of, falling off the edge of the world isn't something that most educated people in the Middle Ages believed. But Christopher Columbus had this plan of just sailing straight off into the ocean, and he would end up in Asia on the other side of the world. Now, the trouble with it is that they would send off, so they sent him off, and a bunch of other explorers were sent off from other European countries in these giant boats, and they were filled to the brim with different sailors and people to try and make their way west and just kind of see where they would end up. The trouble for these people is that when you are trying to go from, say, Spain all the way across to Asia, halfway there, you hit the Americas. So you hit North America and South America, and you land there and you think that you've landed in India or in China or something like that, but in fact you haven't. And so Columbus and other explorers like him went west across the Atlantic, hoping to end up in Asia all the way over here, but instead they ended up in North America. And they met people there, and they called them Indians because they thought that they were in India. Now, of course, they were wrong, and we don't use that word anymore, but that's one of the ways that we just kind of ended up being the way that we are today. So let's talk about some of the major explorers, and then we'll come back and kind of learn a little bit more about each individual one. So one of the first ones was Christopher Columbus, who went to Cuba for Spain in 1492. So he crossed the Atlantic Ocean on behalf of the Spanish government in 1492. And Columbus, if you think of even the name of our province, Columbia, British Columbia, a lot of parts of what is now Canada, the United States, the entire Western Hemisphere is named after him. There's a country called Colombia, there's British Columbia, there's cities, and there's all that sorts of things. But he went down to Cuba, which is not really part of Canada, and the Spanish, most of their exploration was concentrated much further south in Mexico and in South America and in the Caribbean. And to this day, those are a lot of places where people still speak Spanish as their main language. Up closer to Canada was Jacques Cartier, and he went to Quebec, which is in Canada, for France in 1534. He visited with Indigenous peoples. In fact, he kidnapped a few Indigenous peoples to bring them back to France. And he tried to start a settlement. He tried to start a little community, but he failed and he left. John Cabot was a little more successful. His name was actually Giovanni Caboto. He was another Italian. The Italians were really good at sailing, but he was working for the English government, and he went to Newfoundland for England in 1497. And Samuel de Champlain, who landed near Quebec, again in Canada, for France in 1608. And he founded the city of Quebec and the colony of New France. And unlike with Cartier, this one, it didn't fail, and they were able to kind of continue the colony going on. So Samuel de Champlain is another one. Now, all of these explorers were looking to find a new way to Asia, but instead they found a whole new world. And you'll see I put found and new in quotation marks because they didn't find it. There were already people who had been living here for thousands and thousands of years. And it wasn't a new world to those people. So, from the Europeans' perspective, they found this whole new world. And to this day, we still call this time in history the age of discovery because they were discovering all these things. But for Indigenous peoples, this was their home. It had been their home for 10,000 years. It wasn't a new world to them. Let's look at a little more about each explorer. So here's a short video produced by the Heritage Minutes, which are a great charity that produces information on Canadian history, about John Cabot and his first voyage to Canada.
Senor Cabot! On deck, sir. You won't believe your eyes. Captain! Over here! You must see this! Captain, down there. I've never seen anything like it in my life. It's amazing. It's so amazing. Codfish, so thick they stayed the progress of our ship. Your fleets will have no further need of Iceland. Fish is enough to feed this kingdom, oh sire, until the end of time.
So there's John Cabot, and again, he was working for the English, even though he was an Italian, and he told them that there were so many fish off what are called the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, and that prompted all sorts of Europeans to come over and to try and go fishing, because fish were a great food to eat in the Middle Ages. You didn't need refrigeration, you could dry them out, and they fed many Europeans at that time. So fleet after fleet of fishing ship from Europe would start coming over to that area of Newfoundland that John Cabot, again, in quotations, discovered. Now, here is Jacques Cartier, the first Frenchman to come to what is now Canada.
What's he saying, Father?
Commandant Cartier is saying this nation's name is Canada.
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 Beg pardon, sir, but the word he used, I think it really means those houses down there.
No, believe me, I know the word. It means nation, and Canada is its name.
Canada.
But I'm sure it means the houses, the village.
And so here we've got another explorer, Jacques Cartier. So he was the first Frenchman who made his way to what is today Canada. And as we read in the book, in The Story of Canada by Janet Lunn, his first visit here did not go very well for the Indigenous peoples. And it didn't go very well for him either, because he visited and he wasn't prepared for the cold winter. And he was lucky that there were people there who were able to help him survive that winter. Now, unfortunately, what he decided to do was pay back their kindness with some unkindness. And he actually kidnapped two of the children of the chief of that village and took them with him to France. And when he was in France, they were shown around, and he visited the French king, and all sorts of people were amazed that these people had come here and visited with him. And then Cartier returned them to France, but then the next time he went, he took the chief, Donnacona, back to France with him as well. And unfortunately, poor Donnacona died in Paris on the other side of the Atlantic from his home village. And Cartier's little settlement, his little, starting a French village in what is now Quebec, failed the first time round. The third really big important explorer that I want to talk about for Canadian history is Samuel de Champlain. And I said that he came over to what is now Quebec, and unlike Jacques Cartier, he was successful in founding a settlement. Now I'm going to play this video again from Historica Canada. It's so good in terms of describing what he did in his life. Whoops.
The unrelenting winter cut through the colony of New France. An explorer and mapmaker, Samuel de Champlain had been sent across the Atlantic to build an outpost in what we now call Canada. In 1608, along with his men, he constructed a fortified trading post to support the vast French fur trade network and to act as a base for his own colonial ambitions. Some of the indigenous people who lived there called it Quebec, the place where the river narrows. Champlain claimed the land and its resources for France. By that first winter, he could only watch as disease claimed the lives of most of his men. The few that survived to spring were weakened by scurvy and hunger. Out of necessity, Champlain and the remaining French relied on alliances with the indigenous peoples in the area, the Innu of the St. Lawrence, the nations of the Ottawa River, and the Huron-Wendat of the Great Lakes. From these relationships, they learned how to survive the harsh winters. With indigenous guides, Champlain was able to successfully navigate the territory's rivers. He claimed that their birch bark canoes were the only craft suitable for navigating these important trade routes. Convinced that indigenous peoples had no legitimate religion, he introduced Catholic missionaries to the growing colony in 1615. The priest's mission was to convert these allies to Catholicism, which they believed would save their souls and civilize them to European ways of life. By the time of Champlain's death in 1635, several French families had settled on the land. And the few indigenous groups he had convinced to farm in the region lived just outside the city walls. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City at the place where the river narrows. It became the most important settlement in the colony of New France.
So, as I mentioned in the previous video there, as the Europeans met the people who lived here in Canada and northern United States and all around the Americas, what they started to do was they tried to trade with them for various goods and to convert them to Christianity. Now, the explorers also created their own colonies. Now, a colony is a new word, but a colony is basically a mini country that is owned and controlled by another country. So, for example, the colony of New France was owned by, well, you guessed it, France. And there were about 4 European countries that had colonies in North America at around this time. So there was Spain, who had colonies in what's about Mexico and Texas and Florida, and all throughout the Caribbean. The English, who had colonies in Virginia, Carolina, Massachusetts, all parts of things that are currently states in the United States. The Dutch, so that's like the people who live in Holland or the Netherlands, they had a colony in what is now New York, but the English pretty quickly were able to kick them out. And so this all became a British colony or an English colony. And then the French had their colony throughout New France, which is around the area. The heart of it is Quebec, but it also includes like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, parts of Newfoundland. And the British had a little tip in Newfoundland as well. And you guys might be interested, but if you think about it, at this point, there is no European settlement or contact up here where we are in the Pacific Northwest of the continent. Now, what I'd like you to do here, which is going to be pretty neat, is I'm going to ask you all to take your, what I'm going to have you do here is I'm going to have you all pause the video and then get some crayons or pencil crayons, because we're going to draw a map of some of the different explorers and kind of the routes they took and when they took those routes. So the first one we're going to draw is going to be the one for, let's draw in green, a line for Christopher Columbus. Now he's coming off from Spain, so he's coming off from around here, and he went across the ocean, across the Atlantic Ocean, and the exact route isn't important, but he went here to what's now Cuba, and he did that in 1492. So I'm writing on my computer, so it's not going to be great, but I'm going to write 1492 and then Columbus. Now I'm only going to write this once on here because it's kind of tough to write it on the computer. You guys will find it easier to write on your paper. But we're going to mark the 4 routes of those really 4 kind of key explorers. Now, Columbus, he never came to Canada, but he's considered the first European to come over during the Age of Discovery, even though Leif Erikson, as we talked about, one of the Norsemen, had come over earlier. So we're going to mark him too. Now, the next one that we're going to mark is after Columbus comes across in 1492, why don't we put in red, coming from England, so up here, and he went across the North Atlantic, we have this gentleman, John Cabot. And again, that's his English name, not his Italian one, because in Italian it would have been Giovanni Caboto. And he comes over in 1497. And I'm not going to write Cabot, but you guys can write Cabot below in red as well. And now we have 2 Frenchmen. We've got the first one to come over is Jacques Cartier, and France is around over here. So I'm going to have a little line coming over, and he comes over, and he goes all the way across the Atlantic again, and he ends up around here near present day around where Quebec is, and that comes over. His first voyage is in 1534, and he comes back actually twice. That's the whole deal with when he's kidnapping Donnacona and his sons, and he comes back twice, and that's that one. And that's Jacques Cartier. And the final one that I'm going to show you, and what we'll do is maybe in purple, is coming from a similar place and a very similar route is the final French, well, not the final French, but the successful French voyage of of Champlain, and he comes over in 1608. He actually came over a few times. He came over earlier and went to Nova Scotia, but his really kind of key voyage was 1608, and that was the voyage that he did where he went to Quebec, and he founded the colony there in Quebec, the colony that became New France, and that today makes such a big difference in Canada. That's the reason for which you guys are taking French classes, because he came over here in 1608, and he founded Quebec. And that's one of the reasons that we still have a French-speaking population in this country, because he started that. He was the first Frenchman to found the colony over here. So he's considered the father of New France. So those were the kind of the routes that they took over. Now, you would have seen in the previous video about Samuel de Champlain that the European settlers who came over here were not very well prepared. Canada, particularly Quebec, is extremely cold, and it wasn't quite that cold in Europe. So they weren't prepared for the winters that we had here. And another problem they had is that if you think back to the fact that there's no refrigerators on these ships that they take over, when they arrived here in North America, they had not had fresh food, like fresh fruit or vegetables, for months, for weeks and months at a time. And what happens when you don't have those vegetables and those fruit is that you don't have enough vitamins in your body to support your body. And one particular disease that a lot of them had was something called scurvy. Now, scurvy is what happens when you don't have enough vitamin C. And vitamin C, it comes from oranges, it comes from apples, it comes from fresh fruit, from salads. But all that would rot without a refrigerator, right? So after a while, if you were on a boat, you would only be eating things like bread, things like dried fish or dried meat. And so these gentlemen would get scurvy, these sailors, and so they would lose their teeth. They would have pale skin, their eyes would sink, and eventually they could die. They could just start bleeding, and they couldn't stop that blood from flowing. And they would get these, and their blood wouldn't what we call clotting. So it wouldn't heal, and they would just, get a little cut, but it couldn't heal because there was no vitamin C. So in any case, Indigenous people taught them how to survive when they came over here in this harsh climate. And a lot of the French explorers were saved from scurvy when the local Indigenous people taught them how to make tea from spruce bark that contain lots of vitamin C. So they get over here in the winter, there's still no fresh food because, there's no fruit or vegetables growing in the winter, but there are the evergreen trees, and you can use a lot of their needles if you boil them up and put them in a tea to make a tea that is really rich in vitamin C. So they would drink this tea and it would revive them, and their teeth would stop falling out, they would heal up. And so the Indigenous people were actually really central to the survival of the first European settlements here. Now, as the Europeans' colonies kind of expanded, what they started to do was they traded manufactured goods like metal, cloth, guns, and alcohol for furs that were supplied by Indigenous people. There was an especially huge demand in Europe for beaver pelts, which were used to make hats. If you think about the beaver, where the beaver lives, right, like it lives underwater. So its fur is extremely, extremely good for being waterproof. And so people would sell these beaver furs to the Europeans, and the Europeans would send them back to Europe, and they would make them into hats for the fancy and the top, the elite of the society, so that they could not get wet in their head. And the indigenous people were amazed by metal and cloth and guns and alcohol, which they did not have in their own communities. Things like a metal pot, right? A metal pot makes cooking so much easier. A gun makes hunting so much easier, right? So these were things that were very new to the indigenous people and they really wanted. And so they would trade something that they had a lot of, i.e., beaver and furs, for something they didn't really have very much of, which was metal, guns, cloth, that sort of thing. So the earliest European colonies had this relationship of fur trading with the indigenous peoples who lived here. Now, there were a group of Frenchmen who traveled west, and they usually would go in these canoes, in birch bark canoes, and they would go west from Quebec, and they would trade with indigenous people further into the interior of Canada. And they were called coureurs de bois, which is French for runners of the woods, and voyageurs, travelers. And these men who would go out into the backcountry, out into further deeper into Canada, were some of the very first explorers that started to open up this continent. And that is basically the story of how the Europeans accidentally ended up in North America and started founding these colonies. And so next week, what we'll do is we'll talk about what happened in the first European settlements in North America. And we'll talk about what happened when those settlements started to expand and get bigger and bigger, and how indigenous people reacted to Europeans starting to kind of take over parts of their land.